Hello, 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 hello. Thank you for joining me. We need to have a talk because there are some things that you need to know about the Tarot Handbook by Angeles Arrien. I read this book recently and I have many thoughts. In fact, as I started putting together notes for this video, I realized there's a lot I want to say. I know that this is a book that a lot of people are aware of, but I also know there's a lot of people who are not aware of this book, especially tarot readers who are a little bit younger, because this book came out in, I think, like 1983. And there are some concepts that Angeles Arrien was the first person to bring forward that we still see a lot of people talking about in the tarot world today. And I don't think everyone knows the origin of these concepts. So I want to give Angeles Arrien some credit. I'll talk throughout the video about some of the really interesting ideas that she came up with. And we're really just going to dive into this book, my thoughts on this book, what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, and just some rambles in general. If you decide to purchase this book, obviously I encourage you to look for it at your local bookshops, but if you must buy it from Amazon, shameless plug, capitalism baby, you can use my Amazon affiliate link, which I will put in the description of this video, and I will get a very small kickback if you decide to go that way. As we are diving right in, the first thing I want to share with you is the entire long title of this book, which is The Tarot Handbook, Practical Applications of Ancient Visual Symbols. Tarot symbols from a psychological, mythological, and cross-cultural perspective. Does this book live up to the title? Kind of, but not really. I would not say that this book dives into the psychological aspect of the cards with any type of depth. It's more sort of self-helpy, more new agey. I'm not saying there's nothing of value in that, but I wouldn't call it a rigorous psychological book. And then in terms of the mythological and cross-cultural perspectives, Angeles Arrien, who did sadly pass away in 2014, she did have a PhD from the California Institute of Integral Studies. So I don't know anything really about this particular organization, but I will say that one of the things that was disappointing to me about this book is there's not really a lot of sources. She does sometimes talk about certain symbols, and I noticed that she would make a lot of sort of big, broad generalizations. Like I think there was a couple of times where she would say like, in Asian cultures, X, Y, and Z. And as I'm reading that, there's kind of some flags going off in my head in terms of like, okay, are we lumping all Asian cultures together? Like, what specifically are you talking about? Angeles Arrien was actually contemporaries with Joseph Campbell, who's a very well-known and very well-regarded person who studied myths. And when I read Joseph Campbell's work, I feel like it's much more scholarly. There's a lot of citations, whereas with this book, it often felt like I wish I kind of knew what more specifically she was referring to. So that aspect of it, I think, wasn't my favorite. It could have been done better, but there was still some interesting things in terms of how she talked about different cultures. I wished it would have been a little more, I don't even think it should have been more scholarly. I just wish there would have been more specificity and less things that felt like generalizations. But despite those questionable things, as I mentioned already, there's a few ideas in this book which have been very influential and are still very prominent in the tarot world today. In particular, Angeles Arrien was the first person to talk about personality and soul cards, which a lot of you might be familiar with. You can find a ton of articles online about how to calculate your personality and soul card, but it's essentially just adding up the dates in your birthday, and then there will be a certain major arcana card. If you've been into tarot for any amount of time, if you spend time in tarot circles online, or even if you've read other tarot books, you've probably come across personality cards and soul cards. They've gone on to become something that is very, very widespread. Another really big idea that Angeles Arrien was the first person to propose is the idea of a collective card for the year. For example, as I'm filming this, it's 2022. To find the collective card for the year, you simply add up the numbers in the year. So 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6. Henceforth, 2022 is a year of the lovers. Again, if you spend time in tarot circles online, I would guess you've seen people talking about this concept, but what I don't see so often is people giving credit to Angeles Arrien for being the one to come up with this concept. And I'm not trying to say that every single time we talk about any idea, we have to be like super rigid of, oh my gosh, where did this idea come from? But I just think it's nice to give people credit when they come up with something that becomes really influential and that becomes really interesting and helpful to a bunch of other people. I believe the way that I first heard of this book was through Mary K. Greer, because some of you may be familiar with Mary K. Greer's work. She has a few books like Tarot for Yourself and Who Are You in the Tarot, which was originally published as Tarot Constellations, which is, I love that title so much better, but that's a whole other tangent. Anyhow, Mary K. Greer and Angeles Arrien were friends. They shared a lot of information and ideas about tarot together, and with Angeles Arrien's blessing, Mary K. Greer went on to expand on a lot of the concepts in her work that Angeles Arrien originally came up in this book. I personally resonate more with Mary K. Greer's way of explaining things, but I still found it really interesting to sit with this book and find the original seeds of where these ideas came from. Something else important to know about the Tarot Handbook is it's actually based on the Thoth deck. This, I think, might be the first book that I've read or that I have that is based on the Thoth deck and not like Rider-Waite-Smith. The Thoth system is not for me. I still found it interesting to read about, and I will say that even if you are also not a person who uses the Thoth system, you still might find some interesting things in here. In fact, there's interpretations for each individual card, and some of the interpretations that she goes through are quite different than what I'm used to seeing because I've learned and I came about more of the Rider-Waite-Smith style. And that actually was really interesting to see some of the differences in the systems. Angeles Arrien does mention that one of the reasons she wanted to write this book is she didn't resonate too much with the way that Crowley explained things, so she wanted to do something from her own point of view. So I'm not really sure how similar or dissimilar this book would be from other resources which talk about that deck, but I just thought that was interesting to note. I will say that reading this book reaffirmed to me why I've never gotten more into that deck, and the reason is this is not dissimilar from the Rider-Waite-Smith in terms of the way that the creators of the Thoth deck really heavily inserted a lot of symbolism, but I find with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck I don't have to feel pigeonholed into maybe what Arthur Edward Waite intended with a certain symbol. I still feel like there's room for me to read that deck in my own way. Whereas my impression of the Thoth deck is I think it would be really hard to work with that deck unless you were pretty dedicated to learning the specific references that were put into the deck, and that's just not something that really interests me, to be honest. In the intro to this book, she talks about the symbolism in the Thoth deck having influences from ancient Egypt, medieval Christian symbols, but something that I think we've seen happening more and more over the years in the tarot world is questioning those symbols, because sometimes these kind of like occult decks, the symbolism that they use can be based on misinterpretation. Sometimes it can be even coming from a place of appropriation or fetishization, and overall they can just be kind of problematic. I'm not trying to say no one should be using these decks or that there's nothing of value in them. It's just something to think about. On that note, this was one of the earlier books to start taking tarot away from being strictly a tool for occultists and move it into something that can be used for personal growth, for sort of like inner reflection. There's a lot of Jungian influences in this book. Those are the types of frameworks that I am personally more interested in, and that's something else I think Angeles Arrien deserves a lot of credit for. Occasionally I see people who are under the impression that tarot being used for more of like self-reflection and personal growth is a super new thing. And I'm like, come on guys, these books coming out in the 80s were really setting the foundation for that already. I can't remember what I said earlier in terms of when this book came out, but I'm looking at my notes now, and it was actually published in 1987. For some additional context with that, 78 Degrees of Wisdom was originally published, I believe, in 1983, and I think same thing for Tarot for Yourself by Mary K. Greer. And all three of those authors, Rachel Pollack, Mary K. Greer, and Angeles Arrien, I think were really at the forefront of bringing tarot more into this realm of personal growth and self-discovery. Before diving into the card meanings, there's a section in this book called Tarot as a Book of Wisdom and a Map of Consciousness. Now, this section of the book is sadly only a few pages long because it was one of my favorite parts of the book. This is where Angeles Arrien lays out some information about her tarot philosophy, some ideas about how the cards work. She goes a little into the history of the cards, and I think there might be some slight inaccuracies in that portion, but in terms of her philosophies of how she uses tarot, I loved this part so much. It really resonated so strongly with me for how I use tarot as well. I want to share a couple quotes from this portion of the book. The tarot operates primarily through the symbolic, non-rational aspects of consciousness, the same state from which dreams communicate. The quality and accuracy of the tarot interpretation depends solely upon the querent's own ability, because it is only a reflection of the focus or level of consciousness of the inquirer. The tarot is an excellent teacher, for as the user advances in expanded awareness, it reflects this expansion and responds uniquely to each individual, never teaching more than the person is capable of receiving. This quote hit me in the gut for a couple of reasons. There's a few things that I talk about a lot when I'm teaching tarot, when I'm mentoring people. One is the idea that tarot can't tell you anything you already know, because tarot is essentially a way to enhance and mirror information that is within you, even if that information is vague or unconscious. And then the second thing, this I even have as a tagline on my website, I say, tarot meets you where you are and guides you towards transformation. And that's essentially what I think Angeles Arrien is saying here. And another quote I want to share with you. Much of the psychological world is concerned with psychopathology, or looking for that which needs to be fixed or healed within the nature. The DSM manual is a diagnostic tool that is used primarily to facilitate therapists in diagnosing people's psychopathology. There is not yet a psychological manual to describe states of wellness. Perhaps tarot is a visual map of both states of well-being and pathology. Tarot has the opportunity to be used by therapists as well as by the individual to assess one's own psychomythology. Again, this book was written in 1983, and today in 2022, I don't even know if a lot of people know this, but this is a growing trend. There are many therapists who use tarot in their practice with their clients. Another thing that I don't know if many people know is that a lot of therapists are just interested in tarot in general. I have a lot of therapists who come to me for tarot readings, and I'm not trying to say that as like a humble brag. I'm just saying that because I don't think a lot of people know that tarot is something that is really used in a professional setting for deep personal growth, self-inquiry, things like that. So after this intro, where the quotes I just shared come from, that's when we start going into the individual card meanings. I already talked a little bit about those, but another thing I'm going to add is those could have really used an editor. There are certain points where they get extremely repetitive. And another thing that I found myself thinking as I was reading this is I wish that she would have put more of her personality into this book. I did go on YouTube and I was able to find a few videos of Angeles Arrien giving talks and presentations, and I found that she came across so much more warm and I could connect with her more in that setting. Reading this entire book, I never really got much of a feel for who she was, and that might have been her intention in writing the book, but I think because tarot is such a personal thing, I would have liked this book to feel a little more like I know who this person is that is talking to me. Something I really enjoyed that she did, just for the major arcana cards, but for each major arcana cards, there is some information on using that card as a visual affirmation. This is something I'm really big on. There's a lot of different ways you can contextualize this. Sometimes I describe it as meditating with a card, but what this is really about is sitting with a major arcana card with the intention of activating the energy of that card within yourself. Because again, tarot is a map of you. It's a map of who we are. And this is one of my favorite things to do with tarot. Usually when I'm doing this, I actually go through and pick a card consciously, and then I sit with that card, and it's hard to describe in words. Maybe I can do a whole video talking more about my ideas on using tarot as a visual affirmation, but it's essentially, again, just really drawing upon the support and bringing forward the energy of that card within yourself. And it's one of my favorite things to do with tarot, so I love that she included a section on that. I wish she would have gone more in depth on it, but I like that she included that at all. Something else that I thought was actually pretty interesting is the section on the court cards, or as they are referred to in this book, the royalty symbols. I'm not sure if that terminology is a thing people use for the Thoth deck in general, or if that's more of Angeles Arrien's own thing. I don't know. Maybe someone, if you know, you can let me know in a comment. Now, what I like about the way that she describes the court cards in this book is she talks about them as different types of mastery. So the way that she talks about the court cards is actually really taking away some of the hierarchy that you sometimes see in interpretations of the court cards, because from Angeles Arrien's point of view, a page, or I think they're called princess in the Thoth deck, but anyway, the page, it's not any less of a master than the king. It's just a different type of mastery. In fact, with the pages, she talks about them having a mastery that is more new. So I really liked that, breaking down that hierarchy and thinking it more from a perspective of there's different paradigms of mastery that come forward in the court cards. I don't really like the term mastery. I've come to, when I'm talking to my clients about the court cards, I often use words these days more like skillfulness or adeptness instead of mastery, so just kind of a side note. Again, even with the court card section, I think this book could have used an editor. Sometimes the writing is just a little stiff or a little clunky. It's hard to connect with it on a personal level, but there were things about it that I thought were really, really good. A couple interesting things in her interpretations for the minor arcana cards. One is that there, over and over, she talks about if you are drawn to this card, then, and then she goes on and gives some information. I'm not sure if this is what she meant, but the way that I interpreted that is that you can apply the wisdom of these cards not only if you literally like randomly pull it in a reading, but if you just feel drawn to it. That's great to me because I do like to do face up tarot. I think there's a lot of value in doing like less traditional readings and just kind of thinking about what card am I consciously drawn to right now. So I thought that phrasing was interesting, if you are drawn to this card. She also, throughout the minor arcana cards, frames them as referring to breaking some type of familial pattern, which is something I don't really remember seeing in other tarot books, and I thought that was kind of interesting, especially for cards that we sometimes tend to think of as darker or scarier. I want to read you in my notes here the way she talked about the Nine of Swords. She wrote, "You are determined to release negative thinking and self-criticalness held in the mind and release self-critical family patterns." It's just kind of a neat way to contextualize when you draw a card that you might think of as like negative or scary, for it to actually be an affirmation that you're breaking some type of difficult pattern that might even be a generational pattern that's associated with that card. I do wish she expanded on that more and talked about like why she's going into that. It kind of just comes out of nowhere, and I'm over here going, this is really interesting. Where did you come up with this idea? Why are we talking about this? Let's go more into this. This is really cool. After the section on the interpretations, there's still a bit more to the book. I'll try and show you. I don't know how good this will show, but this amount of the book here is all after the interpretations, so there's still some more juicy info, including something that I mentioned in a video that I did, I don't know, like within the past month or so, is there's a section on what is referred to as Bardo states, which I believe is a theory or an idea that Crowley came up with. And I'm not going to go too in depth on this, but this is something that particularly kind of caught my imagination. I found the writing again in this section of the book to be a little clunky and a little hard to connect with, but it's still an idea that I found interesting, and I kind of want to just like think about it more for myself and write some of my ideas on this. The general idea is that there are 13 Bardo states, which are essentially problematic states in consciousness, and they are represented by 13 specific tarot cards. Again, with there being somewhat of a Jungian influence in this book, she links that concept to Jung's concept of shadow work, and that paradigm of shadow work is something that is very intriguing to me. So yeah, that aspect with the Bardo states, that's something you might be hearing more from me about in the future. After the Bardo states is a section about tarot constellations, which I mentioned a little earlier. This is one of the coolest ideas in this book to me. In the introduction to this book, Angeles Arrien talks about how she essentially went into this like meditative, ecstatic state and came up with this idea and formed these like constellations in terms of the way that the cards connect to each other. It's pretty straightforward. It's essentially based on numerology, and there's a major arcana card that is sort of the center of that constellation. This ties back into the soul and personality cards, because based on those there will be a certain constellation that is of more relevance to you. As a side note, my soul and personality cards are both strength in the Rider-Waite-Smith system, but in the Thoth system the numbers between strength and 11 are different than they are in Rider-Waite-Smith. So in this system, I have justice in my constellation. She also gives what she calls an archetypical matrix for each of these constellations, which is essentially like a shape that they form. So for example, the Chariot constellation is a spiral, the Justice constellation is a star. I'm not going to talk too much more about this because we could be here all day, but the idea of tarot constellations is very neat, and I am now in the process of reading and working through Mary Kay Greer's book, again, which was originally published as Tarot Constellations. The new title is Who Are You in the Tarot, which is all focused on this particular concept, and I'm loving that book so far. So again, that's probably something I'll talk more about in the future. Also, this section of the book, the Tarot Constellations, has a note in here that it had an editor, and you can tell. Good job, editor. This whole book should have had an editor. I hope I don't sound super negative. I did really like this book overall, but editors are important. There's some additional information in the book that I haven't got too much in depth on myself, but there's some things about like going back and tracking your cards for previous years and looking at your growth cycles, and you could really go down a rabbit hole with all of that if you wanted to. After this is a brief section on working with tarot, another quote I want to share with you here. Working with tarot affords the opportunity of using symbols as a visual self-help tool. The symbols in tarot provide a means of looking at what synchronistically is in resonance with our inner and outer processes, and can offer guidance in showing us what's in balance or out of balance. Tarot can offer us daily guidance in looking at our experiences and relationships, and give us a creative opportunity to manifest more of our gifts, talents, and resources. It can also apprise us of certain tests and challenges that might arise during the day for us to face and transform. As a tool that can assist us in our creative expression, It reflects back to us what we are aware of consciously or unconsciously. There are a few spreads included here. I haven't tried any of them yet, but I read through some of them and I really like the idea of them, especially because there's some elements of how she has you lay out the cards for the spread, which is much more ritualistic than I normally do when I'm laying out a spread, and that was inspiring to me. It made me want to try some different methods for laying out spreads. She goes into the Celtic cross here, and instead of calling it the Celtic cross, she calls it the whole person spread, which is actually a really cool way to think of that spread. I like that title. After this is an appendix in the book where, for reasons unknown to me, the card meanings are listed again, but like briefer than in the earlier section, and I don't get it. Like, why is that section there? But it is. And then, this is so weird, but one of my favorite things, because I guess I'm just that much of a nerd, but at the very end of the book is both a bibliography of, I guess, works that she actually used in writing this book, and then just like this really long section of other books on the tarot. And when I tell you that I nerded the fuck out going through and looking at some of these books, because there are so many in here that I'd never heard of, so many books that were published in the 70s, the 80s, even the 60s, that again I'd never heard of. I actually went on a little bit of an eBay spree after going through this section, and I did buy a couple of intriguing old tarot books, so maybe I'll show you those at some point in the future. In conclusion, even though I feel like I was a little bit critical at certain points, I can see how this book has been so influential to the way tarot has continued to evolve and expand to this day. The idea of the tarot constellations, the idea of personality cards and soul cards are just invaluable contributions to the field of tarot, in my opinion. I've mentioned this book in passing a few times as I was reading it, and a few people have already told me it was their intro to tarot, so I know it's not like it's like an unknown book that no one's ever heard of. But again, I think some younger tarot readers may not be familiar with this, and there's some really good things to know about this, so I hope you found some of that interesting. And again, you can look for this at your local bookstore if you want it, or maybe you just enjoyed hearing my thoughts on it and that's good enough for you. Or if you do decide to purchase it from Amazon, like I said, I'll include an affiliate link in the description of this video. Thank you for being here with me, and I hope that, again, you enjoyed chatting about the Tarot Handbook by Angeles Arrien. Take care, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye!